All right, so I'm the anchor of the group, which means I'm the last in the relay race, and I'm going to go through this as well as I can. My colleagues have done a really great job of talking about the traffic, the water, and your air. And I'm here to talk about your pocketbook, what the impacts of that are going to be. I'm sure I'm not the only one that's noticed that prices of things have gone up, cost of living has gone up. It makes it hard for a lot of people to live the way they'd like to now. So let's talk a little bit about your money. First off, you know, what Claire and Laura especially have presented is water and air is one of those things you just can't get away with. So in priority, money might not be the trigger issue for everybody, but I do think you should care about it because when you have a high cost project, there's a reason why we don't build highways every day. It's because they are legacy projects that take generations and they're very expensive. And the more expensive a highway is, the more likely it is to be precarious and not ever come, which is why we've had this highway canceled once, now it's back on the shelf, and who knows whether this is going to continue. Taxpayer respect, Laura kind of mentioned, and so did Bill, and so did Claire, about how we've asked basic questions that we haven't got answers to. These are things that we feel the public should know. And one of the first things we wanted people to know was, how much is this going to cost? I would never go to my husband and say, I'm going to go buy something for the house and it's going to be on the credit card and I'm going to how much is it going to cost? That is just a basic conversation we have. And in this particular project, we don't feel those kind of transparent answers are coming, and that to us defines a lack of respect for taxpayers. And then finally, we've all heard about issues with healthcare, with nursing shortages, problems in long-term care homes, underfunding in education. There's only one pocket that the money comes from, right? And so we can only split a dollar so many ways. So when we choose to put into these type of projects that are very expensive, we also have to recognize that there's a cost to that. It means we can only divert so much to one thing because we have to pay for something else. So we need to look at whether the priorities that we have in this room, or as a country, as a province for sure, are being funded properly. Let's go back to 2021, which seems like such a long time ago. When the bypass was first announced, believe it or not, for about a year and a half, there was never a cost talked about in the public. Never said, hey, we're going to build the bypass and this is how much it's going to cost. We found that really strange and a little bit disrespectful. So we're like, tell us how much it's going to cost. Finally, after much pleasant badgering, in 2021, Minister Mulroney announced it was going to be $800 million. Okay, good, we have a number. Then the Toronto Region Board of Trade, they looked at the project, they said $1.5 billion. Well, that's almost double. So we started to say, hey, MTO, do you have an updated project here? Where is this extra money coming from? Why do we have a new double the price tag? And they refused to give us any data about that. Well, that's actually not entirely true. I did a Freedom of Information request, and I said, please give us all of your information about the cost of the Bradford Bypass. We got an internal document that was at the end of 2021, and it said, the original, I'm paraphrasing here, but I can show you the document if you want. The original estimates of the Bradford Bypass of $800 million is well below what we think it's going to cost. We actually think it's going to cost, and then a lot of black highlighter. So I couldn't get that redacted, so I didn't really know, but I knew it was more than $800 million. Well, what ended up happening then was the Auditor General in 2022 did a whole investigation about highways and about how the province of Ontario funds them, how they move through those projects. You need to know that the Auditor General is an independent officer of the legislature. It is not a political person. Their role is to make sure that programs are getting best value for money and are effective. Anyways, Auditor General went through MTO's own records, used all of their tabulations, and said, oh, actually, MTO says it's going to be $2 to $4 billion. That's a huge price difference, right? And then when MTO staff presented at Bradford West Gwillimbury Council at the end of last year, councillors were very concerned about what is this actually going to cost, and asked directly, what is the price tag of this project? And they said, we don't know. So we don't know exactly how far it's going to go up. But just keep in mind, if we use the $4 billion price tag and divide that by the 16 kilometers, that means this project's going to cost Ontarians $250 million for every kilometer, making it one of the most expensive highways to be built in recent history. $250 million per kilometer. Going back to the Auditor General, when they went through and looked at the bypass in particular, this project, their internal staff said, this is not ready to go. We do not have all the things we need to push this project. It doesn't have funding. There's studies that are still outstanding. And they said, doesn't matter. We're going to push it through anyways. They actually took money from highways that were fully funded, mostly in the northern area, and then diverted some of those funds to this highway. The Auditor General also found that the highway promises made by the government aren't fully funded. So when they're saying to you that we've got the money for this highway, they technically don't. They haven't diverted the money into an account or set aside to make this highway happen. And the fact that they don't know how much it's going to cost, I mean, just shows that they really haven't done their homework yet, and it's precarious funding. The Freedom of Information request we found, as Bill had mentioned earlier, is that the highway won't be ready for use until at least 2032. Bill and I have had some conversations and calculations. We think this project is at least a year behind, so that's like probably more like 2033. And that's if we don't run into other issues like with groundwater or with air or whatever else. So we've got another decade on a best case scenario before this highway can get used. As I mentioned, the province hasn't decided how this project will be funded, which means, is this going to be owned by private interests and then the province pays it back? They've said there's going to be no tolling, but they haven't decided how much liability the public is going to have for this highway. So is it a private partnership? Is it a consortium with a bank? Is it done something with developers? Nobody knows. Higher costs due to building wetlands, and Claire pointed that out. And also that the highway will be congested shortly after construction. So even though we have to wait a decade, they calculated anywhere from 3 to 5 years after construction, you're going to be congested again, which is why they're now thinking of turning the project from a 4-lane highway to potentially 8-lane highway. And you should also know that the studies that Claire and Laura talked about are not based on a 6 or 8-lane highway, they're based on a 4-lane highway. So $2 to $4 billion if we use the Auditor General report. We talked on the very first slide that you saw when you came in about cheaper solutions. Highways are very, very expensive. This highway being one of the most expensive. Regional road improvements to get traffic relief sooner. On the scale of how much those things cost, especially as what Bill pointed out about the short distance, would be a fraction of the cost of what this highway is going to cost. We're already starting to get, or they've promised, two-way GO train service. That hasn't been factored into whether this highway would be effective or not. But between walking paths and local buses and GO train investments, that could really divert a lot of traffic away. Because you have to remember, when you're forcing everybody to drive, everybody's going to drive. And there's going to be more congestion or more traffic jams. But there's people that don't want to drive or don't need to drive or can't drive, that if you give them options, they won't drive. So when you force everybody into communities where that's their only way around, what you're going to just get is traffic, right? You have to give people, it's like building a room with one door. Everybody's going to use that door because you've given them no options. That's a reason why if you look around, there's multiple doors here, so that you don't get to congestion. It's the same deal with moving your community. If you give them just one option, that's the one they're going to choose, and everybody's going to complain saying, why is everyone driving? Well, because that's all they can do. We worked with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives to think about what could you use this money for, and I think that this would resonate with maybe some people here. For about $1 billion, 12,000 more nurses across the province. For about $1.5 billion, all seniors in long-term care home would have more staff, more care. For about $850 million, reduce the class sizes across the province from junior kindergarten to grade 8. And for about $1.5 billion, expand OHIP coverage for seniors and youth across the province. Okay, not just like for one community, across the province. What we're talking about here is almost, for the same amount that the high end is, we can almost do all of those things, right? But we're choosing one highway when we could choose regional road improvements, we could choose alternatives that put our money to make sure that our kids, our neighbors, our family members are taken care of. So Brent Toddarian is a planner that I really like, And because I'm a planning nerd a little bit now, I would never have admitted that before. And he said, if you design your town or city for cars, it fails everyone, especially drivers. So if you're someone that needs to drive, you don't want as many drivers on the road. That's why you go when it's not busy, right? You avoid other drivers. But if that's the only way you get them around, you're going to just run into more drivers. So there's a picture below on the far left of Bradford downtown. This is like not the Bradford Bypass, but like what it could look like. So you know, it's moving pretty good, 2032. And then 2037, again, not what, I think it's somewhere in Asia. But anyways, this idea of like you're just going to be getting back to traffic congestion. So we're going to pay $2 to $4 billion for this. And then how much more are we going to pay? Right? The 401 didn't start off as like a 16-lane highway. It was always one more lane, just one more lane, just one more lane, and then we'll fix it. But you may not know that traffic engineers, when they consider whether a highway is working well or not to get an A rating, means that it's empty. That's what gets the highest rating for traffic engineering, is when a road is empty. Otherwise, it's underperforming. So they always are working on this idea of like, how do we get it so that nobody's on the road? By building more roads, which, as we've seen, how many people have ever sat through rush hour traffic on the 400 or the 404 or the 401? If lanes fixed it, you wouldn't be in that type of congestion, right? You have to realize when we're talking about traffic, we're talking about moving your community. If you want just a car solution, then you're talking about maybe a highway, but keep in mind, building a car solution means you're going to be getting more congestion. So we want traffic solutions that move your community better. It gives kids or people that are low income or elderly people options to move in your community that they don't have right now. So those real traffic solutions are a lot cheaper. They still provide jobs. They still can help businesses. It doesn't have to be this idea of a highway equals economic activity equals it's good for us. As Laura and Claire and Bill have shown, it's not as simple as it's just good for us. Complete the studies that aren't being done, a value for money audit. Claire went over these again. And we have to start the provincial policies. If we're thinking about a future for all of us, there's probably people in this room that are thinking about, I would like to stay in Holland Landing and age in place. I would like to stay for the rest of my life. What happens when you can't drive anymore? How do you get around your community? Right? That is what we're forcing people to do. That once you get to a certain age or ability, you will no longer have access to your community. Why we have to change that is because we want it to be fair for everybody. We want kids to be able to play on sidewalks and not be afraid of getting hit. We want elderly people or people that are in their golden years to be able to walk safely, to go to the grocery store, or to go get their medication and not have to say, can I get someone to drive me? Can I get an Uber? Can I talk to a friend or family member to get me to places? It's not a fair system, and that's what we keep building. And the policies that the province has been putting out is very clearly making it so that places like Holland Landing and places in other parts of Ontario will be stuck in this style of development forever, until somebody is brave enough to say, we can do this better, because guess what? There's jurisdictions across the world that are way ahead of us by decades, by decades. This isn't something that we have a Canadian solution that only Canadians, I mean, if you go to Denmark, Scandinavian countries, they have just as much snow. So it's not a snow problem. It's that we believe that there's so much space that we can make it inequitable because everybody's going to drive, right? So we have to really think about that. Okay. Thank you, everybody. We're going to turn to questions. I just want to thank everybody for coming and for being patient with us. We know it was a lot of information. It was very dense. We try our best to give you the information. The other thing that's really important to know that I didn't mention in my presentation was that you have to understand where the traffic's going to and where it wants to get to. Mm-hmm. So when they did the traffic studies for along the route, and also I've gone into MTO, like, so you can actually go to MTO and you can look up a community, you can see kind of where the travel patterns are. What for BWG, for Bradford West Gwillimbury, you find that most of the traffic in the morning is wanting to head west and south. They're not coming east to the 404. The majority, over 50%, is heading that way. And another, like 40 some odd percent, is local. And within the Bradford Bypass study, they said that basically if you're in East Gwillimbury or Eugene and you're heading east, you won't see any traffic savings. Local routes will be quicker for you that already exist than the bypass. So to Claire's point, yes, the 400 and the 404 will be busier. And yes, as we have more and more communities that say the only way we're going to let our people get around is by cars, we are going to have a car problem, right? The important point is to get the people that don't want to drive, can't afford to drive, out of their cars. So that takes a little bit of shift, right?
On expropriation, do we know the current cost of all the expropriated lands that has taken place? And would those costs be in part of the 2.4 billion?
The short answer is no, we don't know, because I mean, if it wasn't for the Auditor General, we wouldn't even have the internal records that MTO says that this is what their project is. And every time I ask for the dollar value for money audit, anything from Infrastructure Ontario, who's going to be the agency that will oversee the financing and that sort of thing, I get like a brick wall. It says, sorry, this is all like secret documentation that you don't have access to. So I don't know what that $2 to $4 billion represents. I don't know if that includes expropriation, doesn't include expropriation. I don't know if that's just design costs. I don't know if that's, the other thing is that the route, they're adding interchanges, right? So like certain communities are asking for more interchange. So I don't even know if that $2 to $4 billion is including the final design that we're now seeing floated, because the studies have different so there's a study that has this is how many interchanges, and then the next time you see them saying this is what the final design is, except that wasn't what was in the study. So no, it's a really long answer to get to no, but it's just no. We don't know.